So tonight's talk, well, basically the French Revolution and the American Revolution, philosophical differences having practical effects. The American Revolution is normally dated to 1776, the French to 1789. Seemingly they have a similar cause. Before anyone jumps down my throat, I did say seemingly. The lack of representative government in terms of imposing taxation and regulation. So you have the cry of no taxation without representation in America, although in Western Pennsylvania they always got a little bit confused about this representation bit. They just didn't want the taxation. And in France you get the demands for the Estates Generales, which had existed in France, still formally existed, but had not been called for 150 years or so. What's time between friends? Of the two, a layman would have assumed that the French Revolution would be the peaceful one. After all, the king, Louis XVI, was a man who was peaceful to a fault. He was often described as like a cushion. He bore the impression of whoever had last sat on him. It's not someone who would disagree with anyone. He agreed to call the Estates General because he couldn't pay his debts. Debts partly drawn up by helping to advance the American War of Independence. Seemed to be a very agreeable chap. The American Revolution, on the other hand, was what we would call a war of independence. People in one country or area demanding their independence from another, and also to some extent a civil war, because not all Americans agreed. Some wished to remain under George III, and some did not. For example, one of the most famous battles of the American War of Independence, the Battle of Kings Mountain, has precisely one British person present, as far as I know. The commander of the British forces, Ferguson. Everyone else under his command was American. They lost against other Americans. Americans have always been very good at killing each other. The French Revolution, however, did sort of spiral out of control. One doesn't just have to think of people getting their heads cut off in Paris and a few other major towns. There are also the hundreds of thousands of people who die in internal conflicts in France, mostly nothing to do with guillotines, mostly by being shot or put out into barges and then sunk, or being tied together, men and women, thrown in rivers in what was called Republican marriage, and so on. So it became oddly violent for a revolution which, at least at the start, didn't actually have an enemy. Also, you got other odd things, such as new names for the months of the year, the days of the week, weights and measures. Essentially, many of the French revolutionaries seem to be not wanting to set up a representative government, more wanting to create a new world. Various other people objected to that new world, particularly when it involved, let's say, the confiscation of all church property and the control of the church by the state. You have a difference in language. Both the United States and France have what is called the separation of church and state. I should imagine everyone in this room thinks they know what that means. However, there are two completely different definitions of the term. You don't have to go back to 1789. In France in 1905, the separation of church and state meant the state owned the churches. I'll run that past you again. The separation of church and state in France in 1905 and to this day means that the state owns the churches. In 1790, civil constitution of the clergy, it meant that the priests were civil servants. This is not precisely what Americans understand by the separation of church and state. So there's a practical difference there. So that sort of leads naturally, I would have thought, I hope people might agree, to the question of why. Why do you get two revolutions taking such different paths? Now, there are different theories concerning this. One says, well, the Americans are over here. They're thousands of miles away from anywhere else, apart from local tribes. Once they defeat the British, and once the loyalists either agree to the new country or leave and go to Canada, job done. France is in the middle of Europe. You have nasty reactionary regimes all around them, like our wicked selves, plotting against the people of France. So, of course, France is driven to extreme actions in order to defend itself from our plots, the plots of the Prussians, the plots of the Austrians, and so on. The problem with that interpretation, as Edmund Burke noticed in 1790, was that the French were doing odd things almost from the start. For example, the paper money comes before, not after the war. The Argents are 1790. They are guaranteed by church property, which means that church property must belong to the state. Otherwise, how could the state use it to guarantee anything? So you have a problem there. Also, you have sort of odd sort of things like this. 14th of July, 1789, the Bastille. Still celebrated in France to this day. There is the storming of the Bastille. Except that's not what actually happens. It starts off looking as if the Bastille might be stormed. Yeah, there's fighting and shooting and stuff. But then Governor de Lamy says, well, I don't really want to do this. You want the weapons in the place. There aren't actually any political prisoners here. We all know you just want the weapons that are stored here. Okay, you can have them. You know, he was a typical official of the ancient regime in that he wasn't particularly dedicated. So he comes out. In America, at this point, they'd have patted him on the head, said, right, clear off. In France, what happens is that he is then brutally murdered. And this is celebrated to this day, every 14th of July, not in the main celebration, but to the side, by the ritual killing of a pig, by the modern French left. Now, this isn't a matter of national temperament. If you get the DNA of the typical American and the typical Frenchman, you won't find a cruelty gene in the French. There is no such thing, as far as I'm aware. There's a difference in ideas. Another example is perhaps the two most famous documents. For modern legal purposes, the most important document that comes out of the American Revolution is not the Declaration of Independence. It's the Constitution, which comes out a few years later. And in fact, it's the bit at the very end of the Constitution, the 10 Bill of Rights. These Bill of Rights are about individuals. And in every book you're likely to pick up, it said, well, it's very similar to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. But if you read the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, yes, some of it is about individuals, but a lot of it isn't. It's about the people, the rights of the people as a collective. So that brings you to the philosophy of the two revolutions. If you'd gone to any of the major founders of the American Revolution and you'd ask them, what philosophers have you read? You wouldn't get blanks there, you probably would do today. They would name philosophers. Probably the most important of the time would be Thomas Reid of the the Scots Common Sense School. If you went to France, you would find many different factions of revolutionary, hotly opposed to each other. They were quite prepared to kill each other and often did. But they all followed Rousseau. I put it to you that if you read Thomas Reid and you read Rousseau, you're in different mental universes. And these different mental universes have a practical effect in politics. Doesn't mean that Americans can't be brutal. They often were. But it means the system you set up is going to be different, because the ideas you start with are different. One is defining freedom in terms of individuals, the other is defining freedom in terms of a collective. Even when they're dealing with the same philosopher, he's looked at in different ways. I think it was James McCosh, 1894, who said, just because the French and the Americans talked about John Locke didn't mean they read him in the same way. They didn't. The John Locke of the French Revolution, for example, is a materialist like Thomas Hobbes. And I'm using that word in the philosophical sense, meaning someone who believes that human beings are flesh robots. That is the sense I'm using that word. If you asked an American, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, etc., did John Locke believe in the existence of the soul? They would say, well, of course he did, you idiot. He wrote The Reasonableness of Christianity. What are you talking about? It's a stupid question. So they're dealing with the same person and reading him completely differently. Now, I'm not saying which of them is right on that particular issue. I'm just saying their ideas are different. Nor is it just a question of religion. There's a standard excuse, oh, well, the Americans were very religious, American revolutionaries. By the way, some of them weren't. The French revolutionaries are all anti-religious. Again, that's exaggeration too. No, because even the non-religious Americans were looking at the philosophy in a different way. You can, for example, believe in the reasoning I, the person, without being religious. That was pointed out not by me, but by Alexander the commentator about 2,000 years ago in his work on Aristotle. So you can believe in the existence of individual persons with individual rights against the collective without being religious at all. Benjamin Franklin wasn't particularly religious. Thomas Jefferson wasn't particularly religious. They weren't atheists, but religion wasn't the centre of their lives. In France, even those revolutionaries who were religious, and some of them were, thought in collective terms. The supreme being, as they called him, gave rights to the people as a collective, not to individuals. If you want to look at books on the French Revolution in terms of what they actually did, there are plenty of books by Doyle, who did the 1989 200-year anniversary books, and other writers who can explain to you what an oddly bloody thing it was. You got lots of nasty things in America. You did not get, for example, okay, we'll gang rape this person, then we'll cut her head off, then we'll arrange her hair, then we'll put it on a pole and present it to the Queen as her lesbian lover. Because individuals don't matter, you see. What matters is the sovereign people, so we can do what we like. That you don't get in the American context. Not because the Americans are less cruel by nature, but because their ideas, at least in theory, however they might violate them in practice, were based upon individual rights and natural law and natural justice. The very word revolution, in the terms of the American Revolution, meant going back, revolving to a perceived position where their rights had been respected. The word revolution in the French context meant creating a new society, fundamentally new, as I've already said, days of the week, months of the year, systems of measurement, everything will be new, and notice, everything will be decided from above. We, the lawgiver, will tell you what the general will is. And if you here, let's say all of you, say, no, I disagree with you, I, as the lawgiver, will still tell you what the general will is. Because you are just the will of all. And your will of all is caused by your pride. Your true self-love, the true general will, is worked out by me. I am the lawgiver, and I speak for your true general will. This is what Marxists would later call false consciousness. You only think you don't want me in charge. Really, you do. And I am furthering your general will, even if I execute you. Because the general will, including yours, because you're part of the collective, because remember, Rousseau is basically Thomas Hobbes dressed up. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is Rousseau in a different suit. You are part of the collective, therefore you will your own death, because I represent the collective. Someone has to speak. Someone has to be the queen of the Borg. So you have all been assimilated, and I speak for your true selves, even though you may disagree. But that's only because of your pride, not your true self-love. When we work this out, when we create our new society, when you're educated, then you, or rather your children, or your children's children, will come to see how right I was. And it really is that bad. And it's also entirely sincere. It's not just a grubby power grab. Maximilien Robespierre was called the Incorruptible. You could offer him 1 million livres in gold to save your life, and he would just take that as an insult. He would rather starve than you not die. Because your death is the will of the people. He knows that because he is the people. He is the lawgiver. And that is collectivism. It's not taken to socialism. They were not socialists. A few of them were, like Barbioff and his Society of Equals. Most were not. But they tend in that direction, and the French left look back to them to this day, and I would say rightly. After all, Rousseau was a follower of the Abbé de Marblay, who was probably the first socialist in France, before the word was even invented. The French left have a legitimate reason to look back to these people. The American left, when they pretend to look back and honour, well, they used to up until recently, people like John Adams and so on, no, they're barking at the moon. They have nothing in common with these people at all. So I better keep shum, and you fire away with questions. Show me how wrong I am.
Gosh, that took me by surprise, because I had you speaking for a little while longer.
Then I will speak for a little while.
you could usefully speak for another 10 minutes longer.
Of course. Practical examples. Freedom of speech. What is freedom of speech? Like separation of church and state, I should imagine everyone in this room thinks you know. But there are distinguished philosophers and politicians, and there always have been, who think you're wrong. And they're not corrupt, they're sincere. And, for example, today they dominate American universities, which are dominated by the ideals of the French Revolution, not by the American. What do I mean? To someone who, let's say, followed Thomas Reid or John Locke or even French thinkers such as Montesquieu, old French thinkers, freedom of speech means an individual, you possibly, you come to a particular opinion, you state your opinion, it's I'm a bald whatever, who's got a big belly, and that's your opinion, you state it. Okay, that's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, in the sense that Rousseau would understand it, is that you express the moral imperative, the general will. And absolutely, you have total freedom to agree with me. Your freedom to agree with me and to express the general will is absolute. I will die for it, and I'm completely sincere in that. Of course, if you disagree with me, you have betrayed the general will, you have betrayed the sovereign people, and you must die. The better part of you, your true self, understands this and agrees with me, even though you think you don't. That is the difference between the general will and the will of all. So Robespierre, for example, again a very sincere man, could believe that the people he was executing, deep down in their true selves, agreed that their executions were necessary. They just were struggling and so on because... Well, struggling's an interesting point. I mustn't exaggerate because the French revolutionaries did have a problem. There was the famous case of one of the King Louis XV's mistresses. I think it was Madame de Barry. She broke all the rules of formal execution in that she struggled and screamed for help. You have a certain role to play in an execution. You look sardonically at the crowd. You perhaps express your mild contempt. You put your head on the thing and your head is removed. That's in Paris, not in the provinces where you're being thrown into a river or blown up or whatever. But in Paris it's a sort of ritual power play. She broke the rules by screaming, struggling, asking why she was being killed, stuff like that. And the revolutionaries, not the elite, but the mass, responded by running away. No one admitted to being at the execution of Madame de Barry, but someone must have been, because she was executed. Right to keep and bear arms. Again, your right to keep and bear arms, is it an individual right or is it a collective right? The right of property. Is it for the good of the people or is it for your own good? Every single right. It can sound the same. If you read the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Bill of Rights quickly, they sound the same. If you read the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it sounds much the same as the American Bill of Rights. And if you read them in carefully, you realise, hang on, this is completely different. For example, the UN body thing was mostly written by English collectivists such as E.H. Carr and Harold Lasky. So whilst it sounds individualistic, if you look at the details, it's collectivist. And that's not an accident, it was meant to be. And notice how I've jumped from the French revolutionaries to the socialists, even though I've told you the French revolutionaries were not socialists, because it's a philosophical progression. You go A, B, C. There is a logic in philosophy which leads you from one position to another, which is why I said earlier that when the French left look back to many of the revolutionaries, they have a point. And that's why, for example, to conclude, this is why the American left have now got more honest. For many years they tried to embrace the American Revolution and the American revolutionaries. Sometimes it was a bit insincere, like the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1920s said we will wrap ourselves in the flag and pretend to support the Constitution we despise. But often it was quite sincere, just confused. Now, if you ask them, these are all dead white males, or they were slave owners, or they were men, or in the case of Abigail Adams, they weren't men and they weren't slave owners, but they'd internalised their evil ideology, or whatever. But at least now they honestly admit that they hate these people and everything they stood for, which in a way is actually progress. There you go.